This book is really unlike anything I've ever done before. I am a master of copious footnotes in my work, and I think Burying Mao had well over 400 of them. Footnotes are a way of distancing yourself from the immediacy of your subject matter. It puts a layer of research and past writings in between you and direct reflection on your object of study. This book, China Watcher, has no footnotes. Well, actually it has two, but they're really just technical footnotes. This is a very up-close and personal book. It's not a scholarly book at all. You will learn something about China from it, but you will learn something about me from it, and you will learn something about the field of Chinese studies from it. It's a kind of hybrid type book, but it is not a scholarly book. As Clay indicated, I've been doing China watching, or sinology as we call it in the academy, for a good many years, about 45 now if you count graduate school. And what I'd like to do in 45 minutes or so, is there a clock on the wall? No, I'll have to use my watch. What I'd like to do in 45 minutes or so is sort of skim over, or at least cover some of the highlights or lowlights, depending on how you look at them, of my career. One of the things about writing something that's called confessions, it's not just experiences, it's also screw-ups. And there are a fair number of screw-ups that I've committed in my life, in my career, and I've tried to be honest in documenting at least some of them. So you'll hear the good, the bad, and the ugly about China watching, or at least one man's encounter with China. Clay made reference to the fact that as a graduate student, I spent a year in Taiwan doing advanced language study as preparation for my doctoral dissertation research. And he made a rather brief allusion to the fact that I stole some documents there. And that's true, I did. And that's how my career began. I was studying Chinese at the Institute of International Relations, the Guojiguanqi Yanjiu in Taipei in spring of 1967. No, I'm sorry, I was studying at the Stanford Center, and I was spending time in the library at the Guojiguanqi Yanjiu. I was studying advanced Chinese at the Stanford Center, the inter-university program in Taipei, and not enjoying it at all. I'm fortunate to have a good ear for languages, but I did not enjoy studying Chinese. To me, it was like the drip, drip, drip of water torture, memorizing character after character. And spending an entire year in Taipei, day after day, just facing these routinized drills and memorizations and recitations was a little depressing for me. Other people loved it. I did not. And my year in Taiwan was made even more problematic by the fact that my wife and I had an infant son, less than a year old when we moved to Taiwan in '66, and he became quite ill. He had some kind of undiagnosable or undiagnosed intestinal disorder that almost killed him. He was dehydrating, running high fevers, and none of the medical people we consulted was able to help. And my wife was overwhelmed with this. She was an English major, a Shakespearean scholar, and she didn't want to be in Taiwan in the first place. She would much rather have been in England. But here we were with a sick child, and me so buried in my Chinese studies, language studies, that I really wasn't much help to her. Plus, Taiwan was, in those days, was a rather undeveloped country. There were a lot of problems. A lot of mosquitoes bred in open sewers. The health was bad, the traffic was bad, the pollution was bad. It was a hard place to live. And on top of that, it was a rigid authoritarian political system. So there was a lot of surveillance going on in the country. And all of these things made life a little bit more difficult than it might otherwise have been. But anyway, back to the study of Chinese. I would study, 7, 8 hours a day in class during the week, and then Friday afternoons we had free time. So in order to escape this atmosphere of constant repetition of Chinese characters and rote memorization, I would spend my Friday afternoons at the International Relations Institute, the Guoji Guanxi Yanzhou, in their dirty books room. Yes, they had a dirty books room. But the pornography that was in that room was not sexual. It was political. This was the only room that you could read mainland Chinese periodicals in. And access was very limited. You had to be a foreign scholar or somebody with government clearance before you could get into that room. And there I could read Renmin Herbao, People's Daily, and Hongqi Red Flag, and Peking Review, and various dirty books from mainland China. And this was the height of the Cultural Revolution, spring of 1960, winter, spring of 1967. And fascinating stuff was going on in China, and this was the only place you could go to read about any of it. While I was there on my Friday afternoons, I befriended the librarian at the Institute, an overseas Chinese from Indonesia by the name of David Au. And David was moonlighting as a translator for the Ministry of National Defense, the Guofangbu. And I would chat with him every day when I came in. And this one day in the early spring of 1967, he was very agitated when I stopped to talk to him. It seems the Ministry of National Defense had given him a set of documents to translate. And his job was to render them into good English so they could be sold to the United States government and other institutions of higher learning, the Hoover Institution and so on, at Stanford. And this was a way of ingratiating the Taiwanese regime to the United States government, because these documents were very valuable. They ran commando raids, the nationalists, guerrilla commando raids on the coast of China, up and down the coast of Fujian province. And many of these raids were successful in stealing, in one county, in Lianjiang County, they stole the entire archive of the county party committee, Communist Party Committee, and hauled the whole contents back to Taiwan. It was a treasure trove of information. From those documents, we learned for the first time the depth and true extent of suffering from the Great Leap Forward, about all of the starvation and privation and all the corruption that stemmed from this massive catastrophe was revealed in this set of documents. So these were valuable documents. Well, on this one occasion, David was cursing the ministry, saying, "They've given me 2 weeks to translate this bunch of documents." And I looked on his desk. I was looking upside down. And all I could see was looked like waterlogged, old, wrinkled, crumpled documents with 2 stamps on them. One was Mimida, secret. And the other was the Zhongfa stamp, which is the official document series of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So it was secret, and it was a document of the Central Committee. I couldn't read it upside down, but I was interested enough to sympathize with David and to say, yeah, I know how tough it is. How about letting me help you? I'd be happy to. It's good practice for me. It's much better than memorizing characters and reciting, memorized passages in my classes. This translation will be good practice for me. He said, I can't do that. They'd have my head at the ministry if they found out. I said, they'll never find out. I'll sit right in front of you all day, and you can watch me, and at the end of the day, I'll put everything back on the shelf. You can inspect me. I won't take anything with me. And that way, you'll get your documents translated, and I'll get my Chinese language practice. He finally relented. He really felt he had a little choice. He couldn't do it in the time allotted. So I sat down and I started translating these things. The agreement was no notes, no copies, no nothing. And within a half an hour or so, when I first started looking at the documents, I recognized that this was a gold mine. These were 5 documents from the period between the spring of 1963 and the winter of 1965. And they all were based on analysis of conditions in the rural parts of China, rural areas of China. And they talked about the initiation of a new mass campaign that Mao Zedong had called for, a 社会主义教育运动, or Socialist Education movement, otherwise known as the Four Cleanups, the Siqing. And in the spring of '67, everyone knew that Mao Zedong had had a falling out with his top lieutenants Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping that stemmed, at least, as far as people knew, from the collapse of the Great Leap Forward. After Mao's radical utopian schemes collapsed in a massive wave of starvation in China in '60 and '61, it was Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping who came in to sort of, rescue the baby from the bathwater and to eliminate some of the more radical Maoist programs and reintroduce the idea of individual family farming. That was the big innovation that Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping brought in 1961, 62. And we knew that Mao was angry at them for undoing his Great Leap programs. But a lot of the details of the dynamics of what was going on between Mao and his lieutenants were quite opaque, and we had very little information about that. In 1966, he had purged them both, or at least had them demoted in the party hierarchy, so we had plenty of evidence of his anger. But where did it come from? What were some of the dynamics of it? These documents detailed the steady development of Mao's quarrel with Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. And ostensibly, their quarrel had to do with the techniques of implementing socialist education in this campaign. Mao insisted that there should be a broad mass mobilization, that the poor and lower middle peasants should organize themselves to criticize their cadres who were lax in terms of their willingness to promote socialist ideas and institutions. So he thought it was a problem of class education and ideological conflict, that you had to arm yourself with Leninist, Stalinist thinking, and you had to use that to educate the peasants in terms of their ability to fight off a challenge by ex-landlords and rich peasants who were trying to restore a capitalist economy in China. So Mao believed very strongly that there needed to be an ideological struggle in the countryside. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, while nominally paying lip service to these Maoist goals, really didn't take it very seriously. They didn't take ideological conflict and class struggle as seriously. They believed that the problem with rural China was a big massive wave of demoralization and corruption in the aftermath of this huge starvation wave. That discipline had broken down, organization had broken down, the party was in disarray, and corruption was rampant. People were desperate. They would trade whatever they had to get a little better life. And so Liu and Deng, particularly Liu Shaoqi, argued that the socialist education movement should be about cleaning up corruption, not about class struggle, not about ideological indoctrination. And the differences between them became stronger with the passage of time. Finally, in December of 1964, Mao confronted them at a working conference. And he actually yelled. I didn't know this from the documents. I found out later. The documents just revealed sort of a flat world view of it. But later I found out that they had this knockdown, drag-out argument in December of '64, in which Mao referred to Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping as 走资本主义道路的当权派, as people in positions of authority within the Communist Party who are taking the capitalist road. He accused them of being restorationists, capitalist restorationists. And that, in the Maoist parlance, is an antagonistic contradiction. It means they're enemies. And you deal with enemies through struggle, not through, dialogue or debate, but through struggle. You have to defeat. It's a zero-sum game between ourselves and the enemy. It's not win-win, it's win-lose. And so in those documents, all of this was laid out, and I realized that this was incredibly important. Fast forward, I finished the translations in about 2 weeks. I started cutting my classes at the Stanford Center because this was much more fun, reading these documents. And I finished them just before my year was up in Taiwan. I was about to head off to Hong Kong to start my dissertation research. And the night before I finished the translations, I made a very fateful decision. As I was putting the documents back on the shelf, as I always did, I just had this strong thought. I can't let these go. I can't. I certainly can't remember them. I couldn't reproduce them. I've got to have them. So I did something very, very impulsive. I shoved the originals in an inner compartment in my briefcase that had a zipper on it, and I put everything else back as usual. The notes, the translations, everything else, and I did it in plain view of the guard there, and my heart was just pounding as I took my briefcase and opened it up. You know, you couldn't see the inner compartment, of course, and he just gave me the guard gave me a perfunctory glance, and I got out of there, and I had those documents with me. And I was so nervous, and the adrenaline was pumping so fast, that I got on my motorcycle, and I practically hit a lamppost first and then almost ran over several pedestrians. I was so out of control. And I didn't know where to go. I had no plan. I just knew I needed these documents, and I had to get them back before anybody discovered they were gone. So there were two choices. There were really two places where they had copy machines that I knew of. There may have been more. One was at the Stanford Center itself, but it was locked up. And it was in the Stanford Center itself was located in Taiwan National University, where it's a guarded campus. And I couldn't see myself breaking in a window there and getting caught, you know, breaking and entering, carrying communist top secret Central Committee documents. Taiwan was not a liberal democracy in those days. You get caught with those documents, it's big trouble. So I vetoed the idea of breaking into the Stanford Center. The only other option I knew was the American Naval Hospital in downtown Taipei. And I had been there a few times because my son's life was saved by the fact that I ran into an American naval doctor in Taiwan, just quite by accident. And I told him about my son's condition, and he invited me to come to the Navy hospital and utilize the medical resources there, which I did, my wife and I did, and they saved his life. So I knew the doctors there, I knew the staff, and I knew there was a Verifax machine, that's the precursor of the Xerox, in the office, in the administrative office of the Navy hospital. It was about 8 o'clock at night, I guess, when I got there. It was it was May of 1967. And I walked in hoping that one of my friends was there and that I could get him to copy the documents for me. And indeed, one of my friends was there. But 5 minutes after I got there, and before I could ask him for help, he was called in on an emergency. Some U.S. soldier or somebody had had a seizure of some sort, and so it needed emergency care. So he left me alone in the administrative office. And there's me and my documents, and there's the Verifax machine. So I did what, what I had to do. I just went over and figured out how to run the damn thing, and I started copying. There were about 35 pages of documents altogether in Chinese. And the Verifax machine is not as reliable as Xerox. And some of the copies came out too dark, and some came out too light. So I had to redo several of them. It took me almost 2 hours to get a good set of copies. And fortunately, my friend, nobody else came in those 2 hours. I was very, very lucky. So bottom line, I got the documents copied, went home, and had a very stiff glass of scotch. Well, it wasn't really scotch. We bought our scotch from a black market provider, and he had substituted tea for the scotch. So, so there was small comfort in that Johnny Walker Black Label shot that I took, or thought I was taking. But anyway, the next morning I went back to the Institute with this stuff in my briefcase, and I managed to get it back on the shelf along with all the other stuff unnoticed. So I'd gotten away with it. And that afternoon, I said goodbye to all my friends. I said goodbye to David Au, feeling guilty about what might happen if it was ever discovered that he had, on his watch, those documents had been purloined, but not guilty enough so I'd, give them back. And my wife and I, a day or two later, took off for Hong Kong. And we were at the University Service Center in Hong Kong, which in those days was the major center for doing research on mainland China. Americans couldn't go to China in 1968. So we had to go next door to Hong Kong And the University Service Center was a major research outfit where you could have offices, they had a library, they had copying facilities, meeting rooms, they arranged refugee interviews. It was an all-purpose one-stop shopping site for China research. And I had reserved an office there to do my dissertation research. The first day I was there, the scholars there always have lunch in a common room every day, and they talk about their work. And as the new kid on the block, I had to talk about what I was doing. So I mentioned that I had been in Taiwan and that I was working on a dissertation. My dissertation topic had nothing to do with the 4 cleanups. I had defended a dissertation topic at Berkeley, where I did my PhD. My dissertation topic was on industrial sociology and a test of Mao's hypothesis about the transformability of human nature. Berkeley in those days had probably the best theoretical sociology department in the world, with industrial sociologists like Reinhard Bendix and Seymour Martin Lipset and William Kornhauser and all these really fascinating people. So I was interested in big ideas, not little facts, but grandiose ideas. And so my dissertation was formulated, my project was formulated as a grand test of Mao's ideas of permanent revolution and mass line leadership of a modern industrial society. My argument was going to be that it won't work, that it's incompatible. I had no idea how to test any of this stuff. Fortunately, in my oral exam, my PhD preliminary oral exam, Berkeley in the 60s, where I did my graduate study, was a cauldron of revolutionary activity of all kinds. There was the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Panthers. And then those of us who were studying China were also involved in this debate over the nature of Mao's cultural revolution and his design to transform China. So there was a lot of conflicting currents. And my PhD committee was made up of people who were at absolute opposite ends of the spectrum on all of these issues. My chairman of my dissertation was Robert A. Scalapino. Second member was Chalmers Johnson. Both of those guys were pro-war, anti-free speech movement, and basically very conservative in their political views. They were not at all supportive of the fermentation that was going on in Berkeley. And I was the vice president of the political science graduate students, and we were going on strike, and we were manning the barricades and doing all kinds of things. And Chalmers Johnson, for one, really gave us a lot of trouble. He was not one to tolerate this kind of nonsense on the part of his graduate students. Well, in my oral examination, I had Scalapino, Johnson, and then the third member, the wild card in more ways than one, was Franz Schermann, a sociologist who would go on to write perhaps the best book on Chinese ideology and organization of the 1960s. And he was a radical leftist. Fully supportive of the FSM, free speech movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Panthers, everything liberationist. And I was very worried. I remember as I walked into my oral, I was thinking about the old South Asian aphorism that when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm the grass. And as it turned out, it was actually a blessing in disguise, because they never got around to questioning the hollowness of my dissertation proposal. They never asked for details. They never asked for how I was going to prove any of this stuff or demonstrate any of this stuff. They just, Johnson and Sherman just went after each other like two bull elephants fighting over a female. It was really an amazing thing, and I just got out of the way. So the elephants fought, and the grass escaped with no harm. So I went off to my 2 years in East Asia with a really flimsy dissertation proposal. But again, I never had to come through with it. I never had to follow through, because these documents fell into my lap. I stole them. I ran away with them. And I got to Hong Kong, and at this first lunch with the other scholars there, mostly PhD candidates like myself, another PhD candidate, this one from Columbia University, a fellow named Fred Teiwes, he was talking about rumors that he had heard in Taiwan, that commandos had come away with this batch of really interesting documents. And did I hear anything about that while I was in Taiwan? And I grinned broadly and reached into my briefcase, and I said, "You mean these?" And that started a collaboration. That was in June of 1968. And, no, 67, June of 1967. And that started a collaboration. Fred Teiwes had been looking at radio broadcast transcriptions and newspaper articles and had been talking to refugee informants about the socialist education movement. And so he had all of the documentary evidence from the open sources, and I had the documents, the original documents. So we decided right then and there to collaborate. I had to retranslate the documents first because I had given up my translations, but I did have the original text. So I retranslated them. It took me about 2 weeks to retranslate them. Meanwhile, Fred was correlating all of the data that he had gathered, and within about 4 months, we put together an analytic assessment of the socialist education movement from beginning to end, including, most importantly, its implications for the emerging struggle between Mao Zedong, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng Xiaoping. We wrote a monograph which was published at Berkeley the following year in '68. We did 3 or 4 articles, one in the Asian Survey, several for the Far Eastern Economic Review, and we gained a lot of notoriety from that. But I think that notoriety and that treasure trove of information really launched my career. I never did get around to writing a dissertation on industrial sociology in China. I just followed the opportunity of these documents and where it led me. So we published all this stuff, but even more important for my career was the fact that just before our monograph from Berkeley was published in the spring of '68, an article appeared in the China Quarterly, which is the Bible of China studies, quarterly journal published in London. And in it, a CIA analyst, these were the days when CIA researchers were publishing openly. They weren't hiding behind classification a lot. So they were using open sources and publishing openly. And a CIA analyst by the name of Charles Neuhauser had written an interpretation of the origins of the Cultural Revolution. And he had gained access to my translated documents, the very translations I made, and I could tell because he used my language. It was quite clear that these were my translations that he had gotten, and he must have gotten them from the Taiwanese government, from the Ministry of National Defense. But the fact that he had them meant that these were now open sources. Since he was publishing in an open source, then anything that I published from then on in could not be regarded as contraband. I read through his article, and he misinterpreted the documents. It was quite clear that he had read them hurriedly, and he had interpreted them according to his own view of Chinese politics, which was that there is a bureaucratic structure that is constraining of the leadership in China. And so bureaucratic leadership is the essence of Chinese politics. Whereas there was another faction in the CIA, which I wasn't really too aware of at this time, which took a very different view of things. Well, I basically, I wrote a letter to the editor of the China Quarterly, a long commentary on Neuhauser's article. And I was very brash and young and stupid. And I brashly said, basically, he's full of shit. He's got it all wrong. I don't think he even read the documents in the original, which I knew to be true because I recognized my translations. And I said, he really needs to restudy this whole thing. And he wrote a rejoinder to my letter, which was equally nasty to mine. Unbeknownst to me, I had walked into an internecine quarrel within the CIA, within the intelligence community, because Neuhauser was on one side, and on the other side were arrayed a series of senior CIA intelligence analysts who had made a very different interpretation of Chinese politics, arguing that Mao's in command. Mao is behind everything. Nothing happens without Mao's approval and leadership. And in this case, they were right. And so I became a hero to these guys because I knocked Charlie Neuhauser off his perch. And he never really recovered the stature that he had had before. And I began getting letters and visits from people I'd never heard of in the intelligence community. And when this exchange was published in the China Quarterly, there was so much publicity that I started getting job offers in the mail without having any interviews at all. I never had a job interview in my life. My students come up to me and say, how should I prepare for a job interview? I don't know. Wear a tie, smile. Because they were coming in the mail. Of course, in those days, it was a seller's market. There was a lot more demand than supply of well-trained young sinologists. But I had gotten some notoriety from all this stuff, and so I capitalized on it. And as it happened, I was offered the job of my UCLA mentor, H. Arthur Steiner, who had started me in Chinese studies. He was retiring, and he wanted me to succeed him. So that was one of the easier choices I had, was to go to UCLA. That was 1968. I hadn't written a word of my dissertation at that point. They hired me as an acting assistant professor, which meant they gave me 2 years to finish my dissertation, or else it was going to be big trouble. It was at that point that I took the path of less resistance, and I decided I was going to go back over this socialist education stuff. I had done it very hurriedly my first time in just a matter of a few months. I went back and I started doing more interviews, in-depth interviews with refugees, and I carried the story past 1965 all the way up to 1968 to analyze the impact of the Cultural Revolution on the rural areas of China in the aftermath of the socialist education movement. So I got my dissertation done a month before the deadline of July 1st, 1970. I filed in June of 1970. And at that point, I began the next stage of my research, of my career, which involved, in the early 70s, there was a lot of unknown stuff about the Cultural Revolution, about the struggles among different factions in China. The Red Guards had been demobilized by order of Mao Zedong, but Mao was becoming ill. He was less physically and mentally able, and it seemed as though the buzzards were beginning to circle in China over the issue of succession. And between 1971 and 75, which were the first years that I was working at UCLA, a number of things happened that added to the puzzlement of all of this. There was the remarkable and mysterious death of Lin Biao, Mao's heir apparent. Lin Biao, who had been named only in 1969 as Mao's closest comrade in arms and best student, designated as his successor, suddenly he ran afoul of Mao for reasons that weren't quite clear. But in September of 1971, he died in a mysterious plane crash. Allegedly, he had hatched a plot to assassinate Mao and seize power, and then when the plot was revealed, he tried to make his getaway, and he forgot to fill up his plane with fuel, and the plane ran out of gas over Mongolia, crashed, and everybody was killed. That's the official story. It reeked of contradictions and inconsistencies. First of all, the Russian pathologist who found the wreckage said there were bullet holes in the passengers aboard the plane. So this was not just running out of gas and crashing. Secondly, the plane exploded when it hit the ground, indicating that there was gas in the tanks. So that part of the story was suspect, as was the story that Lin Biao had personally designed a coup and tried to assassinate Mao. Turns out that Lin Biao was a drug addict in those years and was so addicted to sleeping medication that he could barely function. And for a man like that this we know courtesy of the Air Force Chief of Staff's daughter, who wrote a memoir of this period, and she had access to the family secrets. And Lin was so stoned on sleeping medication, opiates, that the night of the alleged coup attempt, when word came that the plot had been revealed and it was time to go, he had to be aroused from a drugged sleep and carried to his car and then driven to the airfield where they took off. It turns out it was probably his son, Lin Li Guo, who was the conspirator, who believed, Mao had a very bad track record with his successors. He turned against several of them. And I think Lin's son recognized the handwriting on the wall and decided to act before Mao did. But Lin Biao himself was probably just a bystander to most of this. But in any event, he was blamed for the coup. He was called many names, a whole campaign of criticism was launched against Lin Biao. At the same time, Mao's illness was becoming more apparent. When he met with Richard Nixon in February of '72, he could barely sit up in his office, in his study, next to his bedroom. His neck was swollen with edema. His doctor had warned him that if he didn't make an effort to get himself healthy, he wouldn't even be able to meet Nixon. And unbeknownst to anyone, right next to to Mao's study, there was a full-scale operating theater set up in case Mao had some terrible problem happen while he was meeting with the Americans. So this was a very sick Mao in 1972. And with Mao's illness and with Lin Biao being dead, the search was on for a new successor. And suddenly out of nowhere comes this newcomer, a 36-year-old, sapling. Now in China, 36 years old is infant. Leadership doesn't come till you're in your 60s and 70s in China. It was a gerontocracy. They had no way of exiting politics. Once they entered, you either go out feet first or you're purged. Otherwise, you're there till you die. And so the leadership in China was in their late 60s and 70s at this time. And here's this 36-year-old guy who suddenly pops up as the vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, heir apparent to Mao Zedong. Who was this guy? There were all these rumors floating around. Nobody knew. Nobody had any definitive information. Some people thought he was Mao's son-in-law, married to his only daughter, Li Na. That was knocked down. All these theories and no information, no hard information. And then, as Mao's health worsened in the early 70s, the succession struggle heated up. And the left-wing forces under the so-called Gang of Four, led by Mao's own wife, Jiang Qing, they were afraid that the Cultural Revolution policies would be reversed, and they would be blamed for some of the chaos that had occurred in the late 60s. And so they were fighting to maintain the reputation and validity of the Cultural Revolution, while a lot of people who had been through at the receiving end of Cultural Revolution criticism and struggle were trying to overthrow, to reverse the policies, just as Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi had reversed the policies of the Great Leap Forward and caused Mao a great deal of consternation in the process. Now, people like Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, Deng had been purged in 1966, but brought back by 1973. And so Mao basically needed somebody to put Humpty Dumpty back together again after the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, so he picked Deng Xiaoping. Zhou Enlai was suffering from cancer at the time, and so he wasn't able to pull the heavy administrative load, and so Mao relied on Deng Xiaoping. But Deng Xiaoping was regarded as a threat to Jiang Qing and her cronies, the left-wing radicals. And so you could see the stress beginning to build. And the leftists had control of the mass media, and so they began to run a number of propaganda campaigns in the media, calling for example, the overthrow of the Duke of Zhou, who was an old figure in classical Chinese history. And it was no accident that the Duke of Zhou, Zhou Gong, shared the same surname as Zhou Enlai. It was clearly a veiled reference to the need to get rid of Zhou Enlai as a traitor and collaborator. And there were all these mass campaigns in the media. And reading about this stuff, we still couldn't go to China, even after Nixon opened up. A few so-called friends of China could get visas among American scholars, but you pretty much had to kowtow to the PRC and the CCP in order to get a visa in those days. I wasn't ready to do that, although maybe in a few more years I might have. In any event, it was really difficult to interpret these things watching from afar, and China watchers spent a lot of time puzzling and trying to figure out what was going on. It reminded me, I remember, of Winston Churchill's commentary about the nature of Kremlin politics in the Soviet Union. He made, the metaphor he used was, we watch under the rug as the dogs are fighting under the rug. And we can see the shapes moving around, but we don't know who's doing what to whom until some bones fly out from under the rug. And then in retrospect, you know who was doing what to whom. But until those bones fly out and you can examine them, all you can do is speculate. Well, that's sort of how China watching was in the 70s, for me and for a lot of people, but not for everybody. There was one of my colleagues at the University of Michigan who really believed he understood it all, that he had it all worked out, all figured out, who was on what side, who was opposed to whom, who was supporting whom. And his name was Michel Oksenberg. And he and I had had a friendship of mixed quality for about 5 or 6 years, since we were both in Hong Kong in the late 60s. He was a couple of years older than me, the senior sinologist, in the younger generation at least. And he was also the fastest rising star in the country in Chinese studies, Chinese political studies. And I had a friendship with him that was reminiscent of, I guess, same-sex siblings. Part bantering, part friendly, part humorous, and part rivalrous. There was a certain amount of sibling rivalry in there. I think I was envious of Mike, to tell you the truth. Otherwise, I have no way of explaining what happened next. Mike gave an interview to Newsweek magazine in the fall, I guess it was, of 1975, right when all of these mysteries were sort of bubbling and roiling the waters. And I read this interview in which he seemed so confident about his ability to analyze everything that's going on. And I decided I would tweak him a little bit. And so I composed a poem for Mike privately, which I sent him in the mail. And it was in the form of a limerick. And a rather sharply pointed limerick at that, which I called For a Peking Tom. That was the first time I ever used the term Peking Tom. And this is what I wrote. They say that Mao crossed up his heir, speaking of Lin Biao, by refusing to vacate his chair. He dumped his successor, who always said yes, sir, by knocking him off in midair, the plane crash of 1971. This story, you may well concede, was invented simply to mislead. Do we really know why Lin Biao had to go? Was he truly undone by his greed? Again, questioning the official story about Lin's demise. And what of our friend Deng Xiaoping, who did the most terrible thing with Sanzi and Yi Bao? This is one of the footnotes in the book. Sanzi and Yi Bao are the policies that Deng introduced in 1962 to privatize agriculture. Pissed Mao off royally. With Sanzi and Yi Bao, he enraged Chairman Mao, yet now he's back on top in Beijing. So I say to you, friend Michael O., with so many things we don't know, it really takes cheek to claim in Newsweek that you can tell Mao's friend from foe. When you state to which factions belong, Chairman Mao, Premier Zhou, and Ms. Jiang, it compounds my confusion, so I draw the conclusion that you are quite probably wrong. And then came the coup de grace, the twist of the knife. These quibbles aren't really gratuitous, for your claims have stirred up a great hue and fuss. But your statements of fact made my colon contract. Where'd you get all that bullshit you threw at us? Mike was not amused when he received that. Can't imagine why. And he wrote me back a really nasty rejoinder. He marked up my poem as if I were an undergraduate in one of his classes. You know, this line is too long, this one lacks meter, this one doesn't rhyme properly. What do you mean we don't know why Lin Biao, had to go? And he gave me a low C on my poem. And that started a feud between us that lasted the better part of 20 years. But it wasn't necessarily the most damaging part of that feud. 5 years later, 6 years later, in 1981, in the meantime, I should say, Mike went on to become a real star in the sinology firmament. Not only was he recognized as the best of the young generation of China analysts, but he also landed a plum job in the administration of President Jimmy Carter as the advisor to, as the China specialist in the National Security Council under Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was Brzezinski's China guy, the go-to guy on China policy. And this was in the period, in the early years of the Carter presidency, when it became clear that Deng Xiaoping, who was just emerging in the aftermath of Mao's death, where Deng wanted very badly to normalize relations with the United States, and for our own reasons, namely the growing Sino-Soviet dispute and the Brzezinski's belief that the United States should lean to one side, lean to the Chinese side in the Sino-Soviet dispute, an opening occurred for us to finish the job of normalization that Nixon had started back in 1972. And so Mike Oxenberg advised Brzezinski that he should offer, make a kind of subtle offer to join the Chinese in a united front against Soviet hegemonism, which was the big word that the Chinese used to describe Soviet aggression, hegemonism. And on a visit to China in May of 1978, Brzezinski, accompanied by Oxenberg, did just that. He dangled the carrot of a common anti-Soviet front in front of the Chinese leaders, and they bit. They went for it. And the process of normalization came to a rapid conclusion. By December of that year, the two countries had normalized their relationship. The Chinese were waiting for some sign that America was truly concerned enough about the Soviet menace as to join some kind of a tacit détente with China. And that came to pass, and that was largely because of the input of Mike Oxenberg. So he really did play a major role in U.S. diplomacy in that period. When he left the Carter administration in 1980, he went back to the University of Michigan, where I might add he was the most successful mentor of Chinese policy analysts that has ever been in the United States. He trained more than 24 top graduate students at Ann Arbor, far more than anybody else has ever trained. So he did a really wonderful service to the profession. But Mike was a very ambitious, very arrogant, very charming guy, and he carried grudges, which I did not know just how deeply he carried them. In 1981, I gave a paper at the Association for Asian Studies National Convention, annual convention, and somebody, I don't know who, chose Mike Oxenberg to be my commentator, my discussant. And I had seen very little of Mike since that 1975 poem. I had seen him once or twice in Washington, and he took great pleasure in his having been so successful in diplomatic circles. He loved the power game in Washington. He loved, for example, humiliating Richard Holbrooke, which was one of his favorite pastimes in the Carter administration. Holbrooke was the Secretary of State's favorite foreign policy guy, and Oxenberg was Brzezinski's favorite, and State and NSC were at each other's throats. And on one occasion, Oxenberg and Holbrooke came to blows and had to be separated on a plane when Oxenberg tried to prevent Holbrooke from being privy to a translation of Deng Xiaoping's speech. So Mike took pleasure in the inner politics of Washington. But when he was finished and came back to academia, his appearance at that Toronto AAS meeting was his very first appearance back on the national academic stage after being in Washington. And I gave my paper. This was a plenary session of the entire AAS conference, 500 people. Normally, they meet in parallel sessions, breakout sessions, 10 or 12 at a time. But for some reason, I guess because Oxenberg was such a celebrity, they decided to have a plenary session with 500 seats in the main auditorium. And I gave this very convoluted paper, which I had written the year before on leave in Lund, Sweden, about the origins of Chinese scientistic thinking, the faith, the mystical faith in the healing and developmental powers of science. And my argument was that they had a faith in science without understanding what it really was, and that some of the Chinese misinformation about science could be traced back to things like Taoist number mysticism and early Han cosmology, and even the I Ching, which Joseph Needham had analyzed very thoroughly, and he had regarded the I Ching as a kind of roadmap to Chinese bureaucratic governance. And I thought those were interesting ideas, so I wove them into this long, very long and very convoluted argument about China's difficulty in adapting to contemporary notions of science as process rather than as revealed truth. And I gave this paper, it took 40 minutes. And I finished. I thought I had done a reasonable job of presentation. I sat down, and Mike gets up from his stool, and he sort of ambles slowly over to the podium, and he gives me this boyish grin that was his trademark, flashes it to me, and then he begins, and he trashed me from one end of that auditorium to the other. First, he sarcastically congratulated me on all the big words, on the polysyllabic words, saying, "Oh, I didn't realize you had such a vocabulary." And he said, "Oh," and he said, "I also wanted to congratulate Rick for his brilliant understanding that history often informs contemporary affairs." And third, he congratulated me for a belated discovery of Chinese culture. I mean, he was just laying on sarcasm after, after abuse, after ridicule. It really wasn't a nice thing to behold, and it certainly wasn't nice being me. And I was in a state of shock. He went on like this for about 15 minutes, just trashing me. And at the end, he sat down, and I had to say something. I had to get up and defend myself. And I didn't have anything to say. I was really in shock. The one decision I made was that I can't fight ridicule with reason. That's not going to work. I can't, make point after point to show where he's wrong. So I had to fight fire with fire, and I gave it back to him as best I could. I said, "Look, Mike, if you'd like some help with the big words, I'll be happy to help." And I said, what else did I say? I said, "Oh yeah, next time you comment on a paper, you probably would be well advised to read it first, because you clearly misinterpreted it." And third, I said, what did I say? Oh yes. And third, I asked him if perhaps there had been some kind of oxygen shortage on his airplane en route to Toronto, so that perhaps there was an oxygen deficit to his brain. I mean, pathetic, really pathetic stuff, but it's all I could think of on short notice. And I got off the stage just as quickly as I could. I disappeared into the men's room and locked myself into a stall. But it didn't really protect me, because people were walking in and, "Did you hear that? What was that? What came over him?" And it was quite clear to me at that point what had come over him. "Your statements of fact made my colon contract." That's what got into him. And he was giving it back to me with a 6-year time lag. After the fact, a lot of people came up to me and said they were appalled by what Mike did. And in fact, that was a pretty good paper. It got published in different versions of it in 3 different places, so somebody liked it, though that somebody was clearly not Mike Oxenberg. I know it's been 45 minutes. Can I take a little longer? How long? When do we have to actually leave? 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock? What's the story?
Maybe another 15.
Okay, 15 minutes will be fine. Because there's one more chapter in this Oxenberg litany. And this, fast forward another, this was 81, fast forward another 8 years. And in that time, Mike went his way and I went mine. We had very little. Occasionally we would meet each other, and we often argued, bickered, but hadn't really had anything like a confrontation. On President's Day weekend in 1989, February 1989, the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, had just been inaugurated. And far away in Japan, Emperor Hirohito had just died. And so the Bush entourage, foreign policy establishment, decided that this would be a good opportunity for the new president to make his first trip to Asia. But he needed to be brought up to speed on developments in Asia. So the White House staff planned 2 briefing sessions, one on Japan, and then because he was going to be in Japan anyway, his staff thought it would be a good idea for him to go hop across the East China Sea to Beijing to get reacquainted with Deng Xiaoping. He had met Deng in the mid-70s when when Bush was the U.S. liaison officer in 74, 75, and Deng had been rehabilitated and was vice premier. So they had had an encounter then. But Bush had been away from China for a long time, and he needed to be brought up to speed. So for the China briefing, the staff invited four China types, four China watchers, to come to Camp David to spend a day on President's Day weekend, 1989, spend a day briefing the president. I was one of the four. Mike Oxenberg was one of the others. The other two were Harry Harding and an economist. We were all political scientists, and an economist, Larry Krauss, from the University of California, San Diego. So the four of us were helicoptered from the White House to Camp David. And before we took off, we had assembled at the southeast, I think it was, southeast gate of the White House, where we were met by the Secretary of State and the President's press secretary. And while we were waiting for transportation to Camp David, the White House guys, we had flown into Washington the night before, and we were instructed to bring our overnight cases with us because we were going to go right to the airport from Camp David. So I had my overnight bag, and I was talking to the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, and Baker was asking me something about the yuan, the yen, the Japanese yen, U.S. dollar exchange rate, complaining that the exchange rate was out of kilter, and he was very angry about that. And I looked over his shoulder while we were talking, and the White House Marine Corps Guard was going through our luggage to make sure there was nothing dangerous, I guess, there. And I'm sort of watching him opening my suitcase as I'm talking to the Secretary of State. And he reaches in my suitcase, and he pulls out my shaving kit, little black leather shaving kit. And he zips it open, and he's grubbing around in there with his hands. And I saw him pull out a marijuana joint. This had been hidden in there for God knows how long. I had forgotten about it. It was in some inner seam of my shaving kit. And I saw him pick it up and hold it up to the light, and my whole life flashed before me. And I could see the headline, you know, "Scholar Busted Bringing Dope to White House." It was terrifying, and my knees practically gave in. But he held it up, he rolled it up, and he smiled. I don't know if he was smiling at me, but he was smiling. And he put it back in the bag and zipped it up. I guess they were only looking for explosives, not drugs. But I was very, very fortunate to escape that. Anyway, so the helicopter finally carried us off to Camp David, where we were greeted by the president, and we spent a whole day in briefing sessions. And we had decided among the four of us how to divide up the briefing. And my part of the briefing was U.S.-China relations. And mine was the third of four briefings, and it was after lunch. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon we started, and I started talking about the current state of U.S.-China relations, what the problems and pitfalls are. And then the question arose. I think it was Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, who raised the question, how should we play the human rights issue when the president meets Deng Xiaoping? I said, well, look, that's not too difficult. The last presidents under President Carter and President Reagan, Carter and Reagan from mid-70s to the late 80s, all had made very strong American statements of support for human rights in China. And President Bush, I think you need to do the same thing. I said, but there's a danger here, and the danger is that you probably should avoid singling out any individual Chinese activists or human rights dissidents for special praise or support. I said, for example, it is well known that Deng Xiaoping has a real grudge, deep, angry grudge against China's leading human rights dissident, a man named Fang Lizhi, an astrophysicist, who had led student demonstrations in 1976 for democratization. And Deng had been furious at Fang Lizhi and had him kicked out of the Chinese Communist Party because he was undermining China's unity and stability. And then later on, as if to rub salt in the wound, Fang Lizhi called Deng Xiaoping a corrupt criminal. And he circulated a petition calling for the release of all Chinese political prisoners. None of these things ingratiated Fang Li-zhi to Deng Xiaoping. So I said, probably a good idea to avoid singling out people like this for special praise, at least in your first meeting. You know, get acquainted, shake hands, have a drink, and then maybe some other time you can raise the issue of Fang Li-zhi. Well, we took a break after that. It was maybe 3:30 in the afternoon, and I was feeling pretty good. I felt I handled it pretty well. And at that point, the ambassador designate to China, Jim Lilly, who was in on the briefing, came up to me, shaking his head, looking very grim, and saying, "Rick, it's too late." I said, "What do you mean?" "Fang Li-zhi has been invited to a presidential banquet in Beijing next week." And I said something that sounded very much like, "Oh, shit." And I said, "That's a very bad idea." I said, "How did that happen?" And he just shook his head and walked away. Well, the rest of the afternoon, we finished the briefings, and they helicoptered us back to Dulles Airport in Washington for the trip home. And I had about a half an hour to kill at Dulles Airport. And I was very troubled by this invitation to Fang Li-zhi, and I thought that this could result in a major incident. And I wanted to know how this could have happened, how somebody had failed, how could this, you know, whole foreign policy establishment have failed to alert the president of the danger of doing this. So I called a friend of mine, a journalist named Jim Mann, who had been the LA Times bureau chief in Beijing for some years, and he and I had hung out together trying to unravel some of these Chinese puzzles, political puzzles. And I asked Jim if I could talk to him off the record. And he said, yeah. And I said, something very disturbing is happening, and I thought maybe somebody like you with your connections could maybe poke around and find out what's going on, see how this invitation could have been issued without anybody raising an alarm. And I said, you may not use anything I tell you. And he agreed. He said, that's fine. And so I flew back to LA, hoping that he would make some discreet inquiries. Next morning, I was feeling very pleased with myself. And I opened the LA Times, and there it is on page 1. Chinese dissident invited to presidential banquet. And I read it, and I was furious. And I called Jim in Washington. I said, what the hell are you doing? You promised. He said, oh, I didn't use the information you gave me. He said, I got it from someone else who was at the meeting. And I said, oh, who was that? And he said, I can't tell you. Got to protect my sources. So he shut me out, left me in the dark. But he had done one thing that I did know about. He had called, because it was in his story, he had called the Chinese embassy in Beijing to verify whether Fang Li-zhi had in fact been invited to that banquet. And of course, the Chinese had no knowledge of that. It was a discreet, private invitation. So this gave the Chinese government the information they needed to block Fang Li-zhi from attending the banquet. More on that in a moment. But no sooner had I finished, angrily confronting Jim Mann, than the phone rings, again, my phone rings, and it's Mike Oxenberg. Now, Mike, because of his service in the Carter administration, was serving as a kind of China liaison guy in the new Bush administration. Even though he was a Democrat, and all of the briefers who had been at Camp David were Democrats, rather interesting for a Republican president to do that. Ronald Reagan would never have done that. But in any event, he was a liaison to the National Security Council as the transition was being made. And Mike, with obvious glee in his voice, said, Rick, did you talk to Jim Mann? And at that point, I very quickly tried to consider what are my options here. And I couldn't think of any good ones. So I said, yeah, I did. And he said, Marlin Fitzwater and the White House are extremely upset. Marlin Fitzwater being Mr. Bush's press secretary. Marlin Fitzwater and the White House are very upset. And they have instructed me, once I found the leaker, to have a personal letter written to the President of the United States apologizing for the breach of confidence. Now, I have to tell you that there was no promise of confidence. They screwed up in not saying that anything that happens here is private. That's a standard disclaimer that you make at high-level meetings like that. Nothing goes out of this room. They never did that. Now, I suppose it's implicit, But I did not break any confidence that I entered into when I talked to Jim Mann, although, you know, obviously I was indiscreet. In retrospect, it was quite clear. I was falling on my sword, and Mike Oxenberg was only too happy to show me how. Anyway, it was small comfort when I learned a few days later that I had been right, that when Fang Lijie set out to attend that presidential banquet, his car was intercepted and pushed off the road by Chinese plainclothes police, who weren't going to let him get anywhere near that banquet. In the meantime, his place setting at the banquet hall he had originally been set up to be at the head table. Talk about rubbing salt into a wound. But in the aftermath of the kerfuffle that emerged after Jim Mann wrote his story, they moved his place card to the very back of the room, hoping that it would be so inconspicuous that nobody would notice he was there. But in any event, it didn't matter because he never made it. They intercepted his car, and when he tried to get out and walk to the U.S. Embassy, they intercepted him there and wouldn't let him in. And Deng Xiaoping gave a very angry speech that day in which he said, "Human rights are not a proper topic on the agenda of this meeting." End of story. End of comment. He was really, really mean about it. So Mike got his second revenge against me. Fortunately, this whole episode had a relatively benign, if not happy, ending. A few years later, in the 1990s, Mike developed a case of melanoma. He had moved to Hawaii to run the East-West Center there and had developed a melanoma on his foot, a highly aggressive cancer. And he was in remission for most of the mid-90s, and he left Hawaii and came to Stanford, where his condition worsened again. He had a recurrence. And in the late 90s, in 1999 and 2000, at Stanford, as his condition worsened and it was clear that it was going to be fatal, his friends and colleagues organized a conference in his honor, which was held in October of 2000. And at that meeting, a number of his friends and colleagues roasted him, a la, you know, the television roast, comedians' roasts. And among others, Condoleezza Rice spoke and some others from the Carter administration. And I was asked to speak, and I recited my poem. It was the first time I had read it in public. Only Mike had seen it up until then, or whoever else Mike shared it with. But it was the first time that I went public with this poem. And this time, Mike, who was quite ill and weakened from both the disease and his chemotherapy regime, this time Mike actually cried. And when I finished reading the poem, he embraced me. And he said, "Rick, I've decided to change your grade. I'm giving you an A-." And I said, "Gee, thanks, Mike. Now, how about that reaming you gave me at Toronto? Do you take that back too?" And he said, "Nah, you deserve that one." When I went into the field, language training was cursory. I didn't start studying Chinese until I was a second-year graduate student. So by the time I finished my PhD work, I had had 3 years of Chinese, and I went to Taiwan, and I told you how unhappy I was with that fourth year of Chinese. But I could converse. I was fluent enough, but not really. Chinese was not my forte. I could get along. After 1979, when normalization occurred, and U.S. scholars could travel to China, there was a big upsurge of academic interest on college campuses in the study of China. And students began studying Chinese as undergraduates. It was almost never done when I was a student. And so by the time they went into graduate school, they had at least 2, sometimes 3 years of Chinese. And moreover, when they finished their graduate studies, they could go right to China and do field work, or they could go to Beijing or Shanghai to do advanced language study. So it was a much more interesting environment in which to be, working on contemporary China, studying the language in mainland China. So they had the advantage of language, a big advantage. And after 1979, they also had the advantage of opportunities to do field research. The closest I could get to China was Hong Kong. after 1979, students could go, all over the mainland, although there was a setback in the early 80s when one enterprising graduate student from Stanford University by the name of Stephen Mosier took advantage of the hospitality of his wife's village in Guangdong province, not far from Hong Kong, and began wheeling and dealing and bringing in things like a Volkswagen van in exchange for information and access to materials. And eventually the Chinese government got wise to what he was doing and kicked him out, but not before he had gathered a lot of very damaging information about the practice of coercing late-term abortions in rural China. He had photographs of second and third term abortions and forced sterilizations under very unsanitary conditions. And when he was kicked out of China, he went to Taiwan, and the Taiwanese government was only too happy to publicize these things. So he published all of these things and got Stanford University in a lot of trouble for having sponsored him. And Stanford kicked him out as a graduate school, whereupon he went to Washington, D.C. and became a major mover in the anti-abortion movement, in the movement that wanted to stop U.S. funds from aiding any family planning activities in agencies that condoned abortion. So all U.S. money to China, family planning money, was stopped, mainly because of this one guy. But anyway, for about 4 or 5 years after this was 1981, for about 4 or 5 years after that, field research was frozen in China. You couldn't go. But by the late 80s, it had started again, mid to late 80s. And hundreds of US scholars were able to go and actually do hands-on research in Chinese field settings, which was a great advantage over what we did. We sat in Hong Kong trying to puzzle together documents. And sometimes we were right, sometimes we were wrong. I would say for the most part, we were right about the big picture. But scholars could now go in and get the details on the ground. So their training and preparation was much better. And methodologically, they also had certain advantages that we didn't have. We were trained as area specialists. That is, we immersed ourselves in the culture and the history and the politics and economy and language of China. But we weren't really looking in a comparative perspective very much, trying to compare China with other societies. If we did, it was only with other communist societies. Beginning in the 1980s, there was a major revolution in social science methodology, which involved the importation of statistical quantitative methods from the economics field, econometrics, and the measurement, the gathering of data and the analysis of data using sophisticated statistical techniques became very common and very widespread. So our students, my students, began to have much more sophisticated training than I had. The same thing was true with formal modeling techniques, deductive reasoning. So I think there's been a dramatic improvement in the training of China scholars, although I think some of these new methodologies can be carried too far.